This photograph you are seeing now was taken on Friday, October 3rd, 1884, in a wide, damp field on the outskirts of Blackburn, England. It shows 38 people standing in front of a massive striped tent, the fabric taut and shimmering faintly under the pale autumn sun. Some of the performers stand on wooden planks raised several meters above the ground. Others rest their hands on ropes or on the shoulders of those beside them. Their faces, fixed and serious, stare directly at the camera, unaware that within 6 hours, every one of them would be dead. All of them, without exception. The image was meant to be nothing more than a simple promotional photograph for Wycliffe's Grand Imperial Circus, a traveling troupe that had been touring the industrial towns of northern England for nearly 2 decades. But the story behind what happened that night, and the mystery that followed, remains one of the most disturbing and least discussed tragedies of the Victorian entertainment age. The troupe was led by Edwin Wycliffe, a tall, sharp-faced man from Derbyshire, known for his restless ambition and his obsessive devotion to precision. He had inherited the circus from his father, who had once worked under the famed impresario Charles Sanger. By 1884, Edwin's show had become famous across the Midlands for blending the wonder of the traditional ring performance with the fashionable curiosity of the human exhibition, acrobats, illusionists, contortionists, and the so-called living marvels that fascinated Victorian crowds. The company counted roughly 40 members. The number fluctuated as performers joined or left. There was the acrobat family from Rotterdam, 6 in total, who performed dangerous routines on wooden beams, suspended near the tent's peak. There were 2 brothers from Ireland who billed themselves as the strongest men alive, a woman named Celeste Darnell, famed for her ability to bend her body into impossible shapes, and several children who had been born within the troupe itself. Some of the children were legitimate apprentices. Others had been taken in under less clear circumstances. The circus world of that era existed in a moral gray zone, a realm of spectacle and necessity, of showmanship and quiet cruelty. The photograph taken that morning shows them all together, the women in worn velvet costumes, the men in patched coats and boots, the children expressionless, standing still as the photographer counted down. Behind them, the enormous striped tent rises from the ground, 30 meters long, 20 wide, supported by an oak beam at its center. It was not a poor tent. Wycliffe had spent what little savings he had to reinforce the structure that summer. He had ordered new cables, fresh canvas from Liverpool, and insisted that the central pole, the heart of the tent, be made from a single piece of seasoned oak. It was meant to last for years. It would last less than a day. The weather that Friday was typical for the Northwest, unstable and restless. Records from the Royal Meteorological Society indicate that a powerful cold front was moving inland from the Irish Sea. Around noon, the sky was clear enough for photography, but by evening, barometric pressure had begun to drop sharply. A small storm system, known later as the autumn downburst of 1884, was forming above Lancashire. At 7:30 that evening, the show began as scheduled. Tickets had been sold through the week, posted notices in shop windows, a few small advertisements in the Blackburn Standard, promising an evening of wonder, light, and human curiosity. Admission was 3d for standing room, 6d for reserved benches, and 1 shilling for the front seats. For an industrial worker earning 15 to 20 shillings a week, it was an indulgence, but one within reach. Contemporary estimates suggest that between 250 and 300 people attended that night. Entire families, mill workers, children clutching paper cones of roasted chestnuts. The atmosphere before the show was cheerful. Gas lanterns burned low in the corners, filling the air with a faint smell of paraffin. Outside, hawkers sold sweet buns and hot ale. Inside, the ringmaster, Edwin himself, prepared his opening act. The performance began precisely at 8. First came the acrobats, the Dutch family swinging from beams and ropes, defying gravity as the crowd cheered. Then came Celeste Darnell, twisting herself into impossible knots, her movements lit by a single suspended lantern. After her came the illusionist, Thomas Leary, who presented The Vanishing Bride, an act involving a mirror box and a volunteer from the audience. By all accounts, everything proceeded flawlessly. Then, around 9:45 p.m., the wind outside began to rise. At first, it was only a faint rustle. The audience hardly noticed. But those who had spent years living under canvas recognized the shift immediately. The tent's sides began to quiver, the ropes to hum, the tall poles to creak slightly under the strain. Edwin Wycliffe, ever the professional, pressed on. His voice grew louder to be heard over the wind, yet witnesses outside later described hearing a low vibration, a kind of deep moaning sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. By 10 o'clock, gusts were striking at speeds approaching 90 kilometers per hour. The great canvas bellied outward, snapping its ropes tight. The oak poles swayed, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing motion. Inside, the show went on. The band struck up its final tune, the children clapped, and Edwin raised his hand to signal the finale. A grand display of the acrobats, forming a human pyramid beneath the tent's central beam. At 10:07 p.m., the central pole cracked. It did not break cleanly. It shattered. A deep, splintering explosion that ripped through the roar of the storm. The entire structure convulsed. Iron cables whipped across the ring with lethal speed, tearing through the crowd. In seconds, the massive canvas collapsed inward, dragging poles, ropes, and lanterns down upon hundreds of people. What followed was chaos beyond description. Those nearest the exits tried to escape, but the fabric, soaked by sudden rain, had turned heavy as lead. It wrapped around them, forming pockets of air and darkness. The wind outside continued to hammer the fallen tent, forcing it down like a living thing. Screams were heard across the moor. Villagers ran from nearby cottages, but by the time they reached the field, the tent had become a single writhing black mass. For 40 minutes, the storm raged, then silence. When the wind finally subsided and rescuers managed to cut through the canvas, what they found was a scene so horrifying that even the local papers struggled to describe it. 312 bodies were recovered, men, women, and children, crushed beneath beams or entangled in the ropes. Not a single performer survived. The following morning, the Blackburn Constabulary cordoned off the area. The coroner, Dr. James Tregerin, was called from Manchester to conduct the inquiry. His official report, preserved today in the Lancashire County Archive, is both meticulous and strangely incomplete. It lists the causes of death: skull fractures, asphyxiation, multiple blunt traumas, and notes the structural weakness in the oak pole. According to his findings, the central beam had contained an invisible internal split, possibly caused by moisture during its transport months earlier. From the outside, it had appeared sound, but there were other details that did not make it into the official record. Letters from Tregerin's private notebook, uncovered decades later, reveal his growing unease. He described finding several of the performers' bodies in positions suggesting acts of protection. The strongman Daniel Kerr, his arm still wrapped around 2 children. Celeste Darnell shielding an elderly woman beneath her own body. Edwin Wycliffe himself near the entrance, apparently attempting to cut through the canvas with a small pocket knife. These details were omitted from the published report. They did not fit the public narrative that followed. In the weeks after the disaster, newspapers initially ran dramatic headlines: "Circus tragedy in Blackburn, hundreds dead." But the coverage faded quickly. Within 2 weeks, it had vanished altogether. There were whispers of pressure from local officials and from businessmen whose factories had funded Wycliffe's tour. The issue of responsibility was legally murky. The owner was dead. The builders who had erected the tent were local laborers, also dead. The timber supplier in Liverpool denied any fault, claiming the oak had passed inspection. The town authorities insisted their permits concerned public morality, not engineering safety. No one accepted blame. Among the victims were members of several respectable families: a merchant's wife, a local magistrate, and 2 daughters of a prominent textile owner. Their families quietly ensured their names were omitted from later public memorials. A mass burial took place 3 days later on a rented plot of land near the river. There were too many bodies for individual graves. They were wrapped in sheets, or when none were available, simply in fragments of canvas from the ruined tent. The grave was marked only by a wooden cross, later washed away by rain. A charity fund was established, collecting modest donations from nearby towns. Some families received 5 or 10 pounds, a fraction of what had been promised in compensation. Most of the poor lost everything: fathers, mothers, children, and drifted into the factories or workhouses. By the winter of 1885, the tragedy had already begun to fade from collective memory. But the story was not entirely forgotten. In 1932, almost 50 years later, a local builder named Arthur Pelling purchased the same field to construct a warehouse. During excavation, his workers uncovered bones, hundreds of them, intermingled with rusted tent stakes and fragments of cloth. The discovery made headlines briefly before the site was quietly sealed and the remains reburied in a municipal cemetery. A small brass plaque was installed, in memory of those who perished in the Wycliffe Circus tragedy, October 1884. No ceremony, no speeches, just a simple plate. The photograph you see today was discovered much later, in 1964, in the attic of a photographer's great-grandson. It was found among glass negatives, bills, and a faded notebook listing the day's exposures. Wycliffe's Circus, group portrait, October 3, 1884. For years, the image was dismissed as just another Victorian curiosity, until a historian traced the names scribbled on the back to the victims of the Blackburn tragedy. Only then did the truth emerge. This was the last known photograph of the troupe, captured 6 hours before their deaths. Look closely at it now. Look at the man in the second row, third from the left. He had a ship ticket to New York for the following week. The woman beside him was to be married the next morning in Manchester. The small boy near the front was learning to read. His name was Samuel, age 7. Every one of them frozen in time. Their entire future extinguished in 40 minutes of wind and darkness. The silence that followed the collapse was not only the silence of death, but of deliberate forgetting. Victorian society, and proud of its progress, its morality, its industry, could not reconcile the fact that 300 lives had been lost in pursuit of cheap amusement. The tragedy was inconvenient. It revealed structural failures, greed, and hypocrisy that reached too close to home. In one of his last letters, Dr. Tregarin wrote to a colleague in London, "It would be wise to discourage any further public discourse on the matter. The victims, though pitiable, were of a certain class whose loss is best met with silence rather than spectacle." That letter was never meant to be read again. But it survived, and with it, the unspoken truth of how easily human lives could be erased when they did not fit the image of respectability. So look again at the photograph. Do not see freaks, or curiosities, or oddities. See human beings, people who worked, laughed, and hoped for better days. A mother who feared heights, but climbed every night. A young man who dreamed of leaving England. A child who wanted to learn letters. The tragedy of 1884 was not only the collapse of a tent, it was the collapse of a society's illusion, the belief that progress and morality were stronger than greed and neglect. By remembering their story, by speaking their names, we restore a small measure of justice to those erased by history. When the storm ended that night and silence fell over the sodden field, something in the heart of Victorian England had already cracked, invisible but permanent. If this story moved you, if you believe that forgotten lives deserve to be remembered, then leave a like, share this video, and subscribe. Because there are still many more stories waiting in the shadows, faces caught in fading photographs, lives suspended just hours before death.